My parents sold my lake house to pay for my sister and her $180,000 wedding. They laughed and said thanks for the wedding present. I smiled and told them to check their mail. Their faces froze when they saw what was inside. I am Valerie. I am 34 years old, and the lake house my grandfather left me was my sanctuary. It was my future. It was my most treasured possession in the entire world. When I discovered that my own parents had secretly sold it to fund my sister Priscilla and her extravagant wedding, something inside of my chest physically broke. I felt a cold weight drop into my stomach. Our family had always operated with a very clear hierarchy. Priscilla sat at the top, shining like the sun, and I was somewhere near the bottom, completely invisible in her shadow. But this betrayal crossed a line that I never imagined was possible. Before I continue telling my story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments down below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want to hear more stories about standing up to family betrayal. Let me take you back to the beginning. My grandfather Arthur was the one person in my family who seemed to truly see me. He saw the real me. While my mother and my father were constantly distracted by the endless demands and dramatics of Priscilla, Grandpa Arthur would take me by the hand. He would lead me away from the noise of our house. He would take me fishing. He would sit me down on a wooden stool and teach me how to fix broken clocks and wooden chairs. He would tell me long, fascinating stories about his own childhood during the long afternoons. He was a self-made carpenter. He built his lake house with his own 2 hands in the 1970s. I spent every single summer there from the age of 5 until I packed my bags and left for college. The lake house sat on 3 acres of gorgeous waterfront property in New Hampshire. The air there always smelled like damp pine needles and fresh water. It was not fancy by modern standards. It was a 3-bedroom rustic cabin with a massive stone fireplace. It had heavy wooden beams across the ceiling and wide windows that opened to a panoramic view of the sparkling water. The wooden dock stretched 20 feet into the lake. I spent countless hours sitting at the edge of that dock. I would let my feet dangle in the cool water while the sun beat down on my shoulders. The old boat house held the vintage fishing boat that belonged to Grandpa Arthur. It also held the green canoe that he taught me to paddle when I was just 7 years old. Every single corner of that property held deep memories that completely defined my childhood. When Grandpa Arthur passed away 6 years ago, the sky above the cemetery was a dull, heavy gray. After the funeral, our entire family gathered together. Everyone assumed that the lake house would be divided among all the grandchildren. They assumed it would be sold to distribute the proceeds as a shared inheritance. We sat in the cold, quiet office of his lawyer. The leather chair squeaked every time someone moved. The lawyer cleared his throat and opened the thick folder. In his will, Grandpa Arthur specifically left the property to me. I can still remember the exact moment the lawyer read those words out loud to the silent room. He read, "I leave my lake house and all its contents to my granddaughter Valerie, who appreciates the value of hard work and solitude. I leave it in the hope that she will find the same peace there that I did." I looked across the mahogany table. The look on the faces of my parents was one of genuine shock. My father dropped his pen onto the desk. My mother recovered quickly. She put on a tight smile that did not reach her eyes at all. She smoothed her skirt and said, "How wonderful, Valerie. You always were the favorite of Arthur." The words sounded congratulatory, but her tone suggested that I had somehow cheated my way into the deed. My father simply looked at the floor. He looked deeply disappointed. I knew he was likely calculating the lost potential income from a massive property sale. Priscilla, who was 27 years old at the time, made no attempt to hide her bitter feelings. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest. Her face turned red. She raised her voice right there in the office of the lawyer and said, "But that property is worth a fortune right now. Why would he leave it all to Valerie? I spent just as much time there as she did." This was categorically untrue. Priscilla had always found the lake house incredibly boring after a day or two. She hated the bugs. She hated the quiet. She always preferred to return to civilization where she could shop at the mall and socialize with her loud friends. This tense moment in the office was just one single example in a lifelong pattern. From our earliest childhood, our family operated with Priscilla as the center of the universe and the rest of us as tiny planets stuck in her orbit. She was the pretty one. She was the social one. She was the one who constantly needed new things. I was the responsible one. I was the self-sufficient one. I was the one who was expected to understand and step aside when all the family resources went directly to Priscilla instead. When Priscilla wanted expensive ballet lessons, my parents magically found the money. When I wanted to attend a summer architecture camp to build my skills, I was told to save up my own babysitting money. There was no college fund waiting for me. When Priscilla crashed her first car just 3 months after getting her driver license, my parents rushed out and replaced it the very next week. They bought her a shiny red sedan. I remember standing in the hallway, holding a heavy stack of books, watching them hand her the new keys. When I needed thick textbooks for my college courses, I worked 2 different jobs to afford them. I would spill hot coffee on my uniform during my night shifts and then stay up until 3 in the morning just to study. Despite this massive imbalance, I managed to build a very successful career as an architect. I put myself through school. I secured competitive internships through my own hard work rather than relying on family connections. Now, I own a small but highly respected firm that specializes in sustainable residential design. I saved every single penny of my salary to build my business from the ground up. My parents acknowledged my professional success with mild surprise. They acted as though they had never expected me to accomplish anything of value without their direct help. Priscilla, meanwhile, bounced from job to job. She was always finding reasons why each position was beneath her. She claimed her bosses failed to appreciate her unique talents. She never stayed at a company long enough to earn a promotion. She worked briefly at a clothing boutique, then a real estate office, and most recently as a social media coordinator for a local bakery. None of these jobs lasted more than 6 months. Throughout her 20s, my parents subsidized her expensive rent. They paid off her maxed-out credit cards multiple times. They never questioned her poor choices. When Priscilla met Desmond 3 years ago, my parents were absolutely thrilled. Desmond came from a family with obvious wealth. He worked at the investment firm owned by his father. He seemed entirely capable of maintaining the lavish lifestyle that Priscilla felt she inherently deserved. He wore perfectly tailored suits. He drove a black sports car. What my parents either did not notice, or what they deliberately chose to ignore, was that Desmond shared the exact same tendency toward financial irresponsibility as my sister. I observed Desmond carefully over the years. I noticed the cracks in his perfect facade. His parents went through a highly publicized divorce, leaving his financial safety net a bit tangled. He drove an expensive car and wore designer clothes. He took Priscilla on lavish vacations to Europe and the Caribbean. However, he lived in an apartment that he could barely afford, and he carried significant, hidden debt. He would order a $100 bottle of wine at dinner, but his credit card would get declined at the register. When they announced their engagement last year, Priscilla immediately began planning what she confidently called her ultimate dream wedding. The initial discussions in our living room involved reasonable venues and normal guest lists. But within a few short weeks, her vision had expanded dramatically. The guest list grew rapidly from 100 people to 300 people. The local country club was quickly replaced by an exclusive, luxury resort overlooking the ocean. The simple white dress she originally pinned on her vision board became a custom designer gown. I was genuinely happy for my sister. I truly wanted her to have a beautiful day. I offered to help with the extensive planning. I even suggested that the lake house could serve as a beautiful rehearsal dinner venue. I thought it would be a stunning location for pre-wedding photos by the water. She wrinkled her nose at the idea. I attributed her reaction to her desire for more glamorous, crystal chandelier settings. I never imagined the dark truth that was brewing behind my back. As the stressful wedding planning progressed, my parents began looking increasingly exhausted during our routine family dinners. My father, who was normally very quick to boast about his business successes, became vague and quiet when asked how work was going. He would stare at his plate of dry roast beef and change the subject. My mother developed a nervous new habit. She started checking her phone screen frantically whenever financial topics arose at the table. She would bite her fingernails and tap her foot against the wooden floor. One evening, I directly asked if they were feeling concerned about the ballooning wedding costs. My father dismissed my valid question with forced cheerfulness. He wiped his mouth with a napkin and laughed loudly. He said, "Your sister only gets married once, Valerie." Though we all silently knew this was statistically unlikely given the long history of brief, intense relationships Priscilla had left behind. He continued, "We want her day to be absolutely perfect." I leaned forward across the table. I offered to write a check to contribute a few $1,000s toward the wedding expenses, even though it would definitely strain my own personal budget. My mother almost seemed ready to accept the offer. She reached her hand out across the table before my father sharply interrupted her. He said, "That is very generous, Valerie, but it is completely unnecessary. We have it entirely under control." In retrospect, the warning signs were flashing bright red right in front of my face. I simply failed to imagine how far my parents would actually go to maintain the toxic family dynamic that had defined our entire lives for decades. 6 months before the wedding date, the subtle hints that something was deeply wrong became completely impossible to ignore. The Instagram feed of Priscilla transformed into a daily showcase of wild extravagance. There was the grand reveal of her dress fabric. She casually mentioned in the caption that the gown was being handcrafted in France and cost $18,000. There were beautiful sample photos posted from her chosen photographer. I later learned through a mutual friend that this photographer charged $15,000 for a basic weekend wedding package. There were weekly, boasting updates about imported floral arrangements, custom foil-stamped invitations, and monogrammed silk napkins. During a quiet Sunday dinner at the house of my parents, I was pouring myself a glass of water. I casually mentioned that I planned to spend a long weekend up at the lake house to do some routine maintenance and check on the property before the winter weather arrived. My mother dropped her fork onto her ceramic plate with a loud clatter. She spoke very quickly. She said, "Oh, you do not need to bother with that right now. Your father hired someone new to look after things up there." I stopped pouring the water. This was complete news to me. I looked at my father and asked, "Really? Who did you hire?" "I have been working with the caretaker, Mr. Johnson, for years." My father suddenly became very interested in his bowl of mashed potatoes. He kept his head down and replied, "Just someone new. Mr. Johnson retired." That felt incredibly strange to me. I had spoken with Mr. Johnson on the phone just 2 months earlier. He had sounded perfectly energetic and he had mentioned absolutely no plans to retire anytime soon. I made a mental note to call him the very next day. When Monday morning arrived, I sat at my office desk. My colleague across the room was loudly complaining about her stressful custody battle, but I tuned her out. I picked up my phone and tried the number for Mr. Johnson. The call went straight to an automated voicemail. I tried calling him again later in the week with the exact same result. I told myself he was probably just busy with a personal matter or traveling to see his grandchildren. But a heavy, cold feeling of unease began to settle in my chest. Something felt fundamentally wrong. Around the exact same time, I noticed another bizarre detail. My parents had quietly removed several framed family photos from the walls of their living room. Specifically, they removed the photos that prominently featured the lake house in the background. When I pointed at the empty hooks on the wall and asked about this, my mother nervously wiped her hands on her apron. She claimed they were simply being sent out to be reframed in a more modern style. Then came the massive shopping spree. Priscilla arrived at another family dinner 2 weeks later wearing a glittering diamond bracelet that I had never seen before. She jingled it loudly on her wrist. She smiled brightly and explained, "It is an early wedding gift for Mom and Dad." The following week, she proudly announced that she and Desmond had officially booked a 3-week luxury honeymoon. They were traveling to Bali and the Maldives. They were staying in exclusive overwater bungalows and private resort villas. The week after that announcement, she pulled into our driveway driving a brand new, silver BMW. She completely replaced her older but perfectly functional car without a second thought. I sat in a small coffee shop downtown with my good friend Nadine. The rain was hitting the glass window next to our table. I wrapped my hands around my warm ceramic mug. I looked at Nadine and asked, "Where is all this money coming from?" The wedding of Priscilla has completely morphed into something straight out of a celebrity lifestyle magazine. And now there are all these wildly expensive gifts and cars, too. Nadine took a sip of her latte. She thoughtfully suggested, "Maybe the family of Desmond is stepping up and contributing a large amount. Did you not mention that his parents have a lot of money?" That theory made logical sense to me. It calmed my nerves slightly. That is, until I randomly ran into Desmond at a local Italian restaurant a few days later. I was standing near the front door, simply waiting to pick up my bags of warm takeout food. He was sitting at a corner table having a loud dinner with a business colleague. I walked over and stopped briefly to say a polite hello. Desmond stood up from his chair. His face flushed slightly. He said, "Valerie, you are exactly the person I wanted to see tonight." To my complete surprise, he leaned forward and gave me an unexpected, tight hug. I stood stiffly, holding my takeout bags. He stepped back and smiled broadly. He said, "I have not had a proper chance to thank you in person yet." I frowned, feeling a knot of confusion tighten in my throat. I asked, "Thank me for what exactly?" He looked at me with wide eyes. He said, "For your incredibly generous contribution to the wedding, of course. Priscilla told me how much it deeply means to her to have your massive financial support." I stood there on the restaurant floor, utterly paralyzed and confused. I repeated the words slowly. "My contribution." Desmond suddenly looked extremely uncomfortable. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He realized he might have spoken completely out of turn. He rubbed the back of his neck and said, "You know what? I think I just misunderstood something Priscilla said. Please just never mind what I said. Have a great night, Valerie." He quickly sat back down at his table and picked up his menu, effectively ending the conversation. I walked out of the restaurant and stepped into the cool night air. I carried my takeout food to my car, but I had entirely lost my appetite. A growing sense of dark dread began to consume my thoughts. The next incredibly strange incident occurred while I was reviewing blueprints at my architecture firm. My cell phone vibrated on my desk. I picked it up and saw it was a call from Marjorie. She was the elderly woman whose property bordered my lake house on the north side. I answered the call. I said, "Hello Marjorie, how are you doing?" She sounded hesitant. She said, "Valerie, dear, I wanted to call and check in with you about the big sale. Will you still be coming up to visit the lake occasionally? My husband and I will truly miss seeing you sitting out on the dock." My heart started pounding against my ribs. I felt the blood drain completely from my face. I gripped the edge of my desk so hard my knuckles turned white. I asked, "Marjorie, what sale are you talking about?" There was a very long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing. Finally, she said, "Oh my goodness. I think I may have spoken out of turn. Perhaps you should really talk directly to your parents, dear." I practically begged her for more information. I pressed her to explain what she meant. But Marjorie suddenly claimed she remembered a very important doctor appointment. She hurriedly ended the phone call, leaving me listening to the dead silence of the dial tone. I immediately pulled up the contact list on my phone. I tried calling the physical landline installed inside the lake house. This was something I rarely ever did, since I usually just showed up unannounced. The automated voice operator stated that the number was no longer in service. My hands began to shake. I quickly opened my internet browser and logged into my online banking portal to check my finances. I noticed something else deeply concerning flashing on the screen. There had been 3 failed, unauthorized attempts to access my primary savings account over the past few days. All of the attempts used an incorrect password. The system showed that the hacking attempts had come from an IP address located in the same city as my parents. At this precise point, I could no longer ignore the massive mountain of mounting evidence. Something terrible was happening with my lake house. My own parents were being deliberately, systematically deceptive. I decided to take the entire next day off from work. I threw a jacket into my car and started the engine. I needed to drive up to New Hampshire to see the property with my own 2 eyes. The 3-hour drive from Boston up to the lake gave me plenty of quiet time to consider the terrifying possibilities. The highway stretched out in front of me like a gray ribbon. I gripped the leather steering wheel tightly. Perhaps my parents had boldly rented out the lake house for the summer season to help pay for the wedding bills. Though they had absolutely no legal right to do so, it seemed like a plausible violation of my boundaries. Maybe they had somehow fraudulently borrowed money against the equity of the house. Though again, they had zero legal authority to sign those papers. The absolute worst-case scenario seemed entirely too awful to even contemplate in my mind. I tried to mentally reassure myself as the miles ticked by. My legal name was listed on the county deed. The annual property taxes were pulled out of my checking account automatically every single year. The final will of Grandpa Arthur had been crystal clear and legally binding. Whatever mess was happening right now, I told myself over and over, it could definitely be fixed by a good lawyer. As I finally turned my car onto the familiar, winding gravel road leading directly to the lake house, I noticed fresh, heavy tire tracks pressed into the dirt. They had carved much deeper ruts than the usual passenger cars. I drove slowly around the final bend. The old, hand-carved wooden sign reading "The Rest of Arthur" that had hung proudly at the entrance for decades was completely gone. Only the empty metal chains remained swinging in the wind. Then, I saw the massive moving truck parked in the driveway. My very first thought, bizarrely enough, was that someone was delivering a large load of new furniture. Maybe my parents had felt guilty and decided to surprise me with brand new couches for the living room. Though, knowing them, that would be wildly out of character. But as I pulled my car closer and put it into park, the devastating reality hit me. I saw strong men carrying heavy boxes and familiar furniture completely out of the house, not into it. They were loading my antique chairs into the dark belly of the truck. A middle-aged couple stood confidently in the center of the driveway. They were actively directing the sweaty movers. The woman was pointing a manicured finger toward the wooden boathouse. The man was holding a yellow clipboard and checking items off with a pen. Neither of these people was anyone I recognized. I stepped out of my car. I could hear the crunch of the gravel beneath my boots. I approached them, forcing myself to take deep breaths, trying desperately to remain calm. I spoke up, raising my voice over the noise of the truck. I asked, "Excuse me, but what exactly is going on here? This is my private property." The woman turned around to face me. She offered a warm, friendly smile. She said, "Oh, hello there. Are you a neighbor from down the road?" I shook my head. I stood my ground and said firmly, "No. This is my house. I am Valerie. This property completely belongs to me." The couple exchanged deeply confused glances. The man stepped forward and politely extended his right hand toward me. He said, "I am Clifford, and this is my wife, Estelle. There must be some massive mistake here. We officially purchased this beautiful property 3 weeks ago. We signed the papers and closed on it last Friday morning." My legs nearly gave out completely beneath me. The world spun in circles. I felt the blood rushing loudly in my ears. I gasped and said, "That is entirely impossible. I never listed this house for sale. I never sold this house to anyone. There must be some terrible misunderstanding." Clifford looked genuinely concerned now. His smile vanished. He turned around and walked to his parked SUV. He opened the door and retrieved a thick manila folder full of legal documents. He walked back and physically handed the heavy folder to me. He pointed at the papers and said, "Here are all the official sale documents from the county. We bought it directly from your parents." "Are they relatives of yours?" I stared at the names printed in black ink. My own parents. They had actually sold my house without my knowledge. They sold it without my consent. I flipped through the crisp pages of the documents. My hands were trembling so violently that the papers rattled against each other. I saw the familiar signatures of my mother and my father signed on page after page. Then, I flipped to the final transfer deed. I saw something that made my blood run absolutely freezing cold. There it was. My own signature. Or rather, a very poor, clumsy imitation of my signature. I looked up at Clifford. My voice was completely hollow. It was barely above a quiet whisper. I said, "This is not my signature. I did not sign a single one of these papers. I never, ever agreed to sell this property to you or anyone else." Estelle looked completely horrified. She covered her mouth with her hand. She said, "Oh my God. We had absolutely no idea. The sale went through a licensed realtor. Everything seemed perfectly legitimate. We have already sold our previous home in the city. We have nowhere else to go." I handed the heavy folder back to Clifford. I struggled with every ounce of my being to maintain my physical composure. I swallowed the lump in my throat and said, "I am so incredibly sorry. But I need to leave right now and speak with my attorney. This property was legally left to me by my grandfather. My parents had absolutely zero legal right to sell it." I turned around and somehow managed to walk back to my car before the hot tears finally fell. I slammed the car door shut. I gripped the leather steering wheel. I sat there in the driver's seat, sobbing uncontrollably. My chest heaved with every breath. I stared through the glass windshield at the beautiful, rustic home that had been entirely mine just yesterday. Now, it apparently belonged to these horrified strangers. Through the tear-stained windshield, I could clearly see Clifford and Estelle having a very animated, panicked discussion in the driveway. They were occasionally glancing my way with expressions of deep pity and extreme concern. After several long minutes, I wiped my face with a tissue. I pulled myself together just enough to safely drive the car. I put the vehicle in reverse and sped down the gravel road. I headed straight back to town, navigating directly to the county records office. I walked into the dusty, quiet building. The clerk sitting behind the glass counter was very sympathetic as I breathlessly explained the nightmare situation. She typed rapidly on her computer keyboard and helped me locate the relevant property documents. Sure enough, there was a public record of the fraudulent sale. It was dated exactly 3 weeks earlier. I read the final sale price. The sprawling waterfront property had been sold for $450,000. As a professional architect who understood the real estate market, I instantly knew that price was at least $200,000 below the actual market value. The sale had been deliberately rushed. The buyers had paid in pure cash to avoid the slow scrutiny of a mortgage bank. As I was pushing open the heavy glass doors to leave the records office, my cell phone began to ring inside my purse. I pulled it out. The screen displayed the name of Marjorie. I answered the phone. Marjorie spoke quickly, her voice trembling slightly. She said, "Valerie, I have been feeling absolutely terrible ever since our phone call this morning. I could not sleep. I think you really need to know what I accidentally overheard." I stopped walking and stood on the concrete sidewalk. I said, "Please, Marjorie. Tell me everything." She took a deep breath and continued. She said, "I was standing in line at the local general store about a month ago. Your parents walked in together. They did not see me standing behind the tall shelves. They were whispering loudly about using the massive sum of money from the lake house sale strictly to pay for the extravagant wedding of Priscilla. Your father specifically said, and I quote, "We need to take care of this sale immediately before Valerie finds out." Marjorie sighed heavily. She added, "I foolishly assumed that you had eventually agreed to the sale as a loving gift. I am so incredibly sorry that I did not call you sooner." I leaned against the brick wall of the building. I thanked Marjorie sincerely for her bravery and for the vital information. I asked her if she would be willing to type out an email to me, creating a formal written statement of exactly what she had heard in that store. She immediately agreed to do it. My very next phone call was to my close friend Gwendolyn. Gwendolyn worked as a highly successful real estate attorney in the city. I sat in my parked car. I explained the entire devastating situation to Gwendolyn over the phone. I tried to speak as calmly as I possibly could, though my voice broke into quiet sobs several times during the explanation. I told her, "They actually forged my signature, Gwendolyn. They forged legal documents. They completely sold my house behind my back just to pay for the wedding of Priscilla." Gwendolyn gasped loudly on the other end. She said, "Dear God, Valerie. That is not just highly unethical. That is completely criminal behavior. That is blatant forgery. That is massive fraud. That is grand theft. You name it, they broke the law. Do you want me to leave the office and meet you somewhere right now? You absolutely should not be sitting alone right now after finding this out." I took a deep breath. I wiped my eyes. I told her I was okay to drive. We arranged to meet immediately at her professional law office back in the city. During the long, quiet drive back from the county office, my phone chimed. I received another automated email notification from my banking institution. It was an alert about yet another failed attempted access to my primary savings account. It was as if learning the dark truth about the stolen house had suddenly opened my eyes to an entire, massive pattern of family deception. My parents were not just desperate. They were calculated. They were trying to drain everything I had to fund the golden child. I walked through the heavy glass doors of the law firm where my good friend Gwendolyn worked as a senior partner. The air conditioning in the lobby was freezing cold against my skin. I checked in with the receptionist, who was quietly discussing a messy custody battle over the telephone with another client. I took the elevator up to the 14th floor. My hands were still shaking slightly as I clutched the thick manila folder against my chest. Gwendolyn was waiting for me in her large corner office. Her large oak desk was covered in neat stacks of legal paperwork. She wore a sharp navy blue blazer and looked at me with deep concern in her eyes. I sat down in the leather chair across from her. I slid the folder across the smooth wooden surface of her desk. I watched her carefully as she opened it. Gwendolyn put on her reading glasses. She spent the next 20 minutes completely silent, reading through every single page of the fraudulent property sale documents. The only sound in the quiet room was the ticking of the wall clock and the crisp turning of the heavy paper. Finally, she took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. She looked directly into my eyes and took a deep breath. She said, "Valerie, this is a completely open and shut case. Your parents had absolutely no legal right to sell that waterfront property. The forged signature on this deed is clear, undeniable fraud. We can get this entire sale officially reversed through the court system, although it will be extremely messy and it will take a considerable amount of time." She leaned forward and folded her hands together. She continued, "The poor buyers, Clifford and Estelle, will have to be heavily compensated for their extreme trouble and financial loss. But my biggest question for you right now is this. Do you want to pursue formal criminal charges against your mother and your father?" The heavy question hit my chest like a physical blow. Did I actually want to see my own parents arrested by the police? Did I want to see them wearing handcuffs? Despite everything they had done to me, despite the massive betrayal of my inheritance and my trust, the answer in my heart was no. I desperately wanted justice. I wanted my lake house back. But I did not want to send them to a federal prison. I looked down at my hands in my lap. I spoke very slowly. I said, I want to handle this incredibly carefully, Gwendolyn. The extravagant wedding of Priscilla is in exactly 3 weeks. I do not want to detonate this massive bomb before they walk down the aisle. Gwendolyn raised her eyebrows in sheer disbelief. She leaned back in her chair. She asked, "You are actually going to let them go through with this lavish wedding using your stolen money after what they did to you?" I had been asking myself that exact same question for the entire drive to her office. Part of me wanted to burn everything down to the ground immediately. I wanted to call the police, drive to the house of my parents, confront them and Priscilla, and expose the entire dark truth right now. But another part of my brain, the highly strategic part that helped me build my successful architecture business from nothing, suggested a very different approach. I looked back at Gwendolyn and explained my reasoning. I said, if I confront them today, it will be complete and utter chaos. The entire focus of the family will be on saving the wedding, not on the terrible crime they committed against me. Emotions will be running extremely high. Somehow, my parents will twist the story, and I will be positioned as the jealous, bitter villain for ruining the special day of my sister. If I wait until the day after the wedding is over, there is absolutely nowhere left for them to hide. The deed is done, both literally and figuratively. Gwendolyn nodded her head slowly. A look of profound professional respect crossed her face. She said, "That makes perfect, logical sense. So, here is our battle plan. We are going to document every single detail right now. We will prepare all the massive legal paperwork in advance. We will get formal, written statements from Marjorie and anyone else who might have relevant information. We are going to build a completely airtight legal case. And then, the morning after the wedding, we deploy it." She smiled a very small, sharp smile. She said, "That is incredibly cold, Valerie. But it is entirely fair." As I drove back to my apartment that evening, my cell phone buzzed repeatedly in the cup holder. I glanced at the glowing screen. There were multiple text messages from my mother happily asking for my opinion on small wedding details. There were pictures from Priscilla showing off her expensive floral arrangements. The sheer cognitive dissonance was staggering to my mind. They were carrying on as if absolutely nothing had happened. They were acting as if they had not just committed a massive felony against their own flesh and blood. I did not respond to a single one of their messages. I was entirely unsure if I could maintain the fake facade of normal family life. That night, I tossed and turned in my bed. I barely slept a wink. I alternated wildly between burning rage, profound grief for the loss of my grandfather Arthur, and complete disbelief. But by the time the morning sun came through my window, one single thing was completely clear in my mind. I was going to get my lake house back. And my family would never, ever be the same again. The official engagement party was scheduled a few days later at the Langham, a prestigious 5-star hotel located in the heart of Boston. Priscilla had originally planned something much more intimate at the local country club of my parents. But, as with everything else involving my sister, her grand vision had expanded dramatically once she realized she had an endless supply of my stolen money. I strongly considered not attending the party at all. I wanted to stay home and watch television. But my absence would raise loud questions that I was not fully ready to answer just yet. I put on a simple blue dress and ordered a car. I arrived at the hotel 20 minutes late, partly due to my severe anxiety, and partly as a very small, personal act of rebellion. I walked into the grand ballroom of the hotel. I stopped dead in my tracks. The massive room had been completely transformed. There were thousands of imported white orchids hanging from the ceiling. There were glittering crystal chandeliers casting bright light across the room. There were 2 giant ice sculptures carved into the shapes of swans. A professional string quartet played classical music in one corner of the room, while dozens of uniformed catering staff circulated through the wealthy crowd carrying silver trays of expensive champagne and hot appetizers. Priscilla spotted me standing near the entrance almost immediately. She rushed over to me. She looked absolutely resplendent in a heavily beaded, custom white gown that could have easily passed for an actual wedding dress. She grabbed my arms and squealed loudly over the music. She said, "Valerie. Finally. I was starting to get worried that you would not make it tonight. Is this room not absolutely amazing? Just wait until you see the massive cake we ordered." I hugged her back very stiffly. My arms felt like heavy lead. I searched her smiling face carefully for any subtle sign of hidden guilt or secret complicity in the theft of my house. But all I saw shining in her eyes was her usual, self-absorbed excitement. I managed to force a tight smile. I looked around the room and said, "It is certainly very elaborate for just an engagement party, Priscilla." She waved her hand dismissively in the air. She laughed and said, "You only get engaged once in your life, Valerie. Well, to the right person, anyway." She giggled loudly, acting as though her two previous, dramatic broken engagements were just charming little quirks rather than deeply concerning life patterns. I swallowed hard and tried to sound entirely casual. I asked, "Where are Mom and Dad?" Priscilla pointed across the crowded ballroom. She said, "They are standing over by the flowing champagne fountain. They are talking to our luxury wedding planner about adding a professional fireworks display to the outdoor reception." Can you even believe it? Actual, real fireworks. I felt a sharp pain in my chest. I nodded slowly and made my way across the thick carpet of the ballroom. I stopped frequently to greet various aunts, uncles, and distant family friends. Every single person in the room was buzzing with loud excitement about the spectacular wedding plans. Several older relatives specifically stopped me to comment on how incredibly generous and wealthy my parents were being to afford such a lavish event. Each unearned compliment felt like a sharp knife twisting directly into my ribs. I finally spotted my parents standing near the towering fountain of flowing champagne. They were deep in a serious conversation with a sharp-dressed woman holding an electronic tablet, who I correctly assumed was the expensive wedding planner. I quietly walked up behind a large potted palm tree. I stood just close enough to overhear their private conversation without being noticed in the loud crowd. The wedding planner was tapping her screen. She said, "The grand fireworks display will add exactly $25,000 to your final budget. But the professional photographs will be absolutely worth the investment. Plus, we just had a sudden cancellation at the estate venue, so we can now offer you the premium outdoor garden space for the cocktail hour for only an additional $5,000. My father nodded his head. I could clearly see the tight, exhausted tension around his eyes. He puffed out his chest and said, "Priscilla deserves the absolute best day possible. Let us go ahead and add both of those premium options to the final contract." The wedding planner beamed with a massive smile. She turned and walked away to make the expensive updates. My mother immediately reached out and touched the arm of my father. She looked around nervously. She lowered her voice and said, "Are you completely sure about this, Thomas? We are already sitting so far over our maximum budget." My father waved his hand and spoke firmly. He said, "It is completely fine, Elizabeth. The house money easily covered all of the main essentials. We can just put all of these extra upgrades on the high-interest equity line." I closed my eyes. I felt physically ill. My stomach churned. The house money. He was talking about my house money. My inheritance. Before I could decide whether to step out from behind the tree and confront them right there in front of the champagne fountain, a loud noise interrupted my thoughts. Priscilla was standing on a small wooden platform at the very front of the ballroom. She was loudly clinking a silver spoon against her crystal glass. She called out into the microphone, asking for the complete attention of everyone in the room. Desmond stood proudly right next to her, wearing a designer suit. The entire ballroom fell silent. All of the guests turned to face the happy couple. Priscilla smiled brightly into the microphone. She said, "Desmond and I want to take a moment to deeply thank every single one of you for coming out tonight to celebrate our beautiful love. And we especially want to thank my absolutely amazing parents, who are making my ultimate dream wedding totally possible." The large crowd applauded enthusiastically. My parents stood near the fountain and waved their hands modestly at the guests, soaking in the unearned praise. Priscilla continued speaking. She scanned the large crowd until her eyes locked directly onto mine. She pointed at me and said, "And I want to give a very special thank you to my wonderful sister, Valerie. Thank you for your incredibly generous wedding gift. We truly could not have afforded to do any of this without your massive sacrifice, sis." Every single eye in the giant ballroom turned to look at me. The silence was deafening. I completely froze in place. I was entirely unable to respond or move my feet as the room suddenly erupted in thunderous applause directed at me. Desmond raised his glass of expensive champagne high in my direction. My parents both smiled broadly from across the room. They raised their glasses toward me as well. My father cupped his hand around his mouth. He called out loudly over the clapping guests, "Thanks for the wedding present, Valerie." A wave of appreciative laughter rippled through the wealthy guests. I felt my face burning hot. I managed to force a tight, closed-mouth smile. I gave a very slight, robotic nod of my head. The very second the attention shifted back to the front of the room, I turned around and walked as fast as I could toward the hotel lobby. I pushed open the heavy wooden door of the restroom. I locked myself inside a private stall. I leaned my back against the cold tile wall. I tried desperately to control my rapid, shallow breathing. My chest heaved up and down. They were publicly thanking me for a massive financial gift that I never actually gave them. They were thanking me for hundreds of thousands of dollars that were stolen from me through illegal fraud and blatant forgery. The sheer, unapologetic audacity of my family was completely breathtaking. After several long minutes of deep breathing, I stepped out of the stall. I walked over to the marble sink and splashed freezing cold water onto my burning face. I looked at my pale reflection in the large mirror. I dried my face with a towel. I was firmly determined to maintain my calm composure. I critically needed to continue gathering solid information tonight. I could not afford to create a loud, messy scene. I pushed the restroom doors open and walked back into the loud party. I circulated slowly through the dense crowd. I accepted completely fake congratulations from various relatives regarding my extreme generosity. I responded to every single compliment with non-committal, tight smiles. My Aunt Patricia finally cornered me near the massive chocolate dessert table. She held a plate of tiny cakes. She touched my arm gently. She looked at me with deep sympathy and said, "Valerie, darling. I heard the incredibly sad news about you selling the beautiful lake house. I know exactly how much that special place meant to you and Arthur. But what an absolutely wonderful, selfless sister you are to make such a massive personal sacrifice for the happiness of Priscilla." I nearly choked on the sip of champagne I had just taken. I coughed into my napkin. I looked at my aunt carefully. I asked her, "What exactly did you hear about the lake house, Aunt Patricia?" She took a small bite of cake. She casually wiped her mouth and replied, "Oh, just that you finally decided to sell the property to help fund this gorgeous wedding. Your mother specifically mentioned to me that you were having some second thoughts about letting it go last month. But she assured me that you eventually came around to the wonderful idea. She said you finally realized you were just not using the cabin enough to justify keeping it." I stared at her. Every single word she spoke was another terrifying revelation of the intricate, fake narrative my parents had carefully constructed behind my back. They were not just desperate thieves. They were actively working overtime to control the entire public story. They were aggressively gaslighting our entire extended family to cover their tracks. If you've made it this far, please do me a favor, like the video and comment number 1 down below. It lets me know how awesome you are and shows that you're right here with me on this journey. Your support is a massive encouragement and truly motivates me. Drop that one so I can recognize you, and now, let's get back to my story. As I continued making my way through the extravagant party, I saw physical evidence of my stolen lake house money absolutely everywhere I looked. The custom-carved ice sculpture depicting Priscilla and Desmond dancing had cost thousands of dollars. The expensive party favors sitting on the tables were heavy, monogrammed crystal champagne flutes. Even the public hotel restrooms had been specially stocked with expensive designer toiletries and massive, fresh flower arrangements just for our guests. I finally encountered my parents standing together near the large gift table. My mother immediately reached out and embraced me in a warm hug, acting completely normally as if nothing was wrong in the world. She pulled back and smiled. She said, "Valerie, you look absolutely beautiful tonight. That dark blue color really brings out your eyes." I kept my arms firmly at my sides. I replied coldly, "Thanks, Mom. This is quite an expensive party." My father stepped forward and put his heavy arm around my shoulders. He smiled proudly and said, "Only the absolute best for your sister. We are so incredibly proud of both of you girls, you know. Priscilla with her upcoming marriage into a wonderful family, and you with your successful little business." I stared at the side of his face. I truly wondered if he realized the massive, sickening irony of his words. Priscilla was currently being rewarded with a $180,000 wedding simply for finding a man to marry her. Meanwhile, my years of grueling, exhausting hard work building an architecture business from absolutely nothing merited only a casual, dismissive mention. I turned my head and looked directly into the eyes of my father. I kept my voice completely neutral and flat. I said, "The lake house sold very quickly, didn't it?" I watched their faces extremely carefully. The fake smile of my mother faltered for just a fraction of a millisecond before she quickly recovered her composure. She blinked rapidly. She asked, "Oh? Have you actually been driving up there recently, Valerie?" I held her gaze. I said, "Yes. I actually met the new owners yesterday afternoon. The Petersons. They seem like very nice people." My parents instantly exchanged a very quick, panicked glance. The color drained from my father's cheeks. He nervously cleared his throat and shoved his hands deep into his pockets. He looked at the ceiling and said, "Yes, well. While the property values in that specific area have really peaked lately, it was a very good time to sell the real estate." I tilted my head slightly. I said softly, "Funny. I do not remember ever putting the property on the market." Another sharp, terrified glance passed between my parents. My mother let out a very high-pitched, nervous laugh. She reached out and patted my arm rapidly. She said, "Valerie, please. This is hardly the correct time or place for this boring real estate discussion. We should really focus all our energy on celebrating the beautiful engagement of Priscilla tonight." I took a slow step back from them. I smiled a completely empty smile. I said, "You are absolutely right, Mother. We will have plenty of time to deeply discuss all of this later." I turned around and walked away from them. I left the party shortly after that conversation. I was physically unable to stomach watching another single second of the sickening farce. The very next morning, I sat at my kitchen table. My dining room was completely covered in stacks of printed papers. I had a yellow highlighter in one hand and a black pen in the other. I was building the fatal file that I would soon hand over to the authorities. I had spent the entire morning pulling my own bank records, printing out the fraudulent deed documents Gwendolyn had emailed me, and scrolling endlessly through the public social media accounts of my sister. I found the most damning piece of physical evidence around noon. I matched a specific Instagram post made by Priscilla directly to the bank records Gwendolyn had subpoenaed. In the bright, filtered photo, Priscilla was proudly sharing detailed pictures of her custom wedding dress. She bragged in the caption that the French lace gown cost exactly $18,000. I looked down at the printed bank statement of my parents. On the exact same day that photo was posted, my parents had withdrawn a cashier's check for precisely $18,000. They were using my stolen inheritance like a personal ATM machine. Then, I tackled the massive issue of the legal notary. How did my parents manage to legally file a forged deed at the county office? The documents required a certified notary public to stamp them and verify the signatures. Gwendolyn had provided me with the printed name of the notary whose official stamp appeared on the fraudulent paperwork. I spent 2 hours searching the internet until I finally found a working phone number for her office. I called the number. A woman answered the phone. I explained the dire situation clearly and calmly. I emailed her a scanned copy of the forged deed. Within 10 minutes, the woman called me back. She was absolutely furious. She firmly confirmed to me over the phone that she had never, ever notarized those specific property papers. She stated clearly that someone had illegally stolen or duplicated her official rubber stamp and forged her signature as well. She aggressively agreed to provide Gwendolyn with a sworn, legal affidavit stating that her official stamp had been used fraudulently to steal my home. The final, most difficult task of the week was writing the formal confrontation letter. Gwendolyn had suggested that while the heavy legal documents would handle the factual and financial aspects of the crime, I needed to write a personal letter to fully address the devastating emotional betrayal. I sat alone at my desk for 3 entire days drafting, deleting, revising, and rewriting that letter. I would type a paragraph, burst into tears, and delete the whole thing. How do you adequately, perfectly express the sickening feeling of having your own parents steal your future from you? How do you convey the endless depth of betrayal when the exact people who are supposed to protect you decide that your private inheritance is simply theirs to take? In the end, I decided to keep the letter incredibly simple, cold, and direct. I printed the final draft on crisp white paper. It read, "Mom and Dad. What you did to me was not just highly illegal. It was a profound, unforgivable betrayal of my trust. The lake house was not just a piece of property to me. It was my deep connection to Grandpa Arthur. He was the only person who actually saw me when the rest of this family did not. It was my quiet sanctuary when life became overwhelming. It was my future. It was my plans. It was my dreams. You took that away from me without asking. You illegally forged my name. You aggressively lied to our entire family, creating a sick fiction where I had willingly consented. You spent my money on one single day of celebration for Priscilla, prioritizing her selfish desires over my rightful inheritance. I am currently pursuing all available legal avenues to reclaim exactly what is mine. The attached legal documents clearly outline the very serious criminal consequences of your actions. This entire nightmare could have been avoided with one simple conversation. Instead, you confidently chose deception, fraud, and theft. The wedding of Priscilla will proceed today as planned. I will not punish her by disrupting her day, though I have very serious questions about her knowledge of this scheme. But once this wedding is over, there will be a massive reckoning. Valerie. The highly anticipated wedding day finally arrived. The weather outside was absolutely perfect, sunny, and clear. It felt as if even nature itself was actively conspiring to give Priscilla her ideal, flawless day. The lavish ceremony was scheduled for 4 o'clock in the afternoon at an enormous, historic stone church downtown. The massive reception was to follow at the Rosewood Estate, which was widely known as one of the most exclusive and expensive venues in the entire region. I arrived at the church 2 hours early for the required bridesmaid photographs. I was wearing the pale pink, silk gown that Priscilla had demanded I purchase. The professional photographer positioned the bridal party on the sweeping stone steps of the church. He spent 30 minutes aggressively arranging and rearranging the folds of our dresses to achieve the perfect, symmetrical composition. Priscilla stood dead in the center of the group. She looked radiant in her custom French gown. It featured a massive 15-foot train that dragged heavily across the stone steps. The bodice was covered in delicate, hand-sewn beadwork that had taken artisans hundreds of hours to complete. Throughout the entire grueling photo session, I maintained my blank composure by quietly, mentally cataloging the massive costs of everything I was looking at. The dress of Priscilla, $18,000. Professional hair and makeup artists for the entire bridal party, $3,000. The premium photographer and videographer package, $15,000. The massive towers of white flowers decorating the church entrance, $8,000. Every single item I looked at represented another piece of my stolen property. Every detail was another cherished memory of my quiet lake house permanently converted into ephemeral, flashy wedding trappings. The church ceremony itself was wildly elaborate. It featured a live string quartet, a professional opera singer, and custom-written, tearful vows. Priscilla cried beautifully on cue at the altar. Her expensive waterproof makeup miraculously remained perfect. Desmond looked handsome and polished in his tailored designer tuxedo. My parents beamed proudly from the very front row of the wooden pews. They looked like the proud, successful architects of this perfect, magical day. I performed my required bridesmaid duties mechanically, like a programmed robot. I held the heavy bouquet of Priscilla during the long ring exchange. I bent down to carefully adjust her massive train whenever she turned around. I smiled brightly for the flashing cameras. But inside my chest, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, hard determination to see my plan all the way through to the bitter end. After the long ceremony concluded, the hundreds of guests were transported to the Rosewood estate via a massive fleet of rented vintage Rolls-Royce cars. The sprawling estate grounds had been completely transformed. There were thousands of blooming flowers, twinkling fairy lights strewn through the ancient oak trees, and elegant white drapery hanging from the ceilings of the tents. The cocktail hour featured a massive raw seafood bar, an expensive caviar tasting station, and a towering champagne fountain that looked identical to the one from the engagement party. I circulated slowly among the wealthy guests. I accepted endless congratulations on behalf of my sister. I skillfully deflected dozens of nosy questions about the sale of my lake house with vague, non-committal responses. I would simply smile and say, it was a very difficult personal decision, or sometimes we just have to make big sacrifices for our family. The main dinner was served inside the grand ballroom of the estate. Every single table featured towering, elaborate centerpieces of rare orchids and pink roses. The extravagant menu included rich Wagyu beef, butter-poached lobster tails, and delicate desserts covered in edible gold flakes. A loud 10-piece band played on a custom-built wooden stage. Professional dancers had actually been hired to encourage the guests to get out onto the wooden dance floor. During the formal toasts, the room grew quiet. My father confidently stood up from his chair. He tapped his glass and raised it high in the air. He smiled warmly and spoke into the microphone. He said, "To my beautiful daughter Priscilla, and to her wonderful new husband, Desmond. Your mother and I absolutely could not be prouder of you two tonight. We have purposely spared absolutely no expense to make this special day perfect for you, because you deserve nothing but the absolute best in this world." The large crowd applauded enthusiastically. The band played a short, happy tune. I took a very long, slow sip of my champagne to completely avoid having to smile. A few minutes later, Priscilla herself stood up at the head table. She swayed slightly, clearly a bit tipsy from the endless champagne. She grabbed the microphone. Her voice was thick with heavy emotion. She said, "I just really want to thank everyone who made this incredible day possible. My absolutely amazing parents, who have always given me everything I ever wanted in my life. My wonderful new husband, who I love more than anything. And my sister, Valerie." She turned her head to look directly at my table. She pointed at me again. She said, "Valerie, who made the absolute biggest sacrifice of all. I know exactly how much that old lake house meant to you, sis. And the beautiful fact that you were so willing to just let it go to pay for my special day means more to me than I can ever properly say." The entire ballroom erupted in deafening applause. I physically felt dozens of pairs of eyes staring at me, expecting me to stand up or say some kind of loving response. I simply sat perfectly still in my chair. I raised my crystal glass slightly in the air and gave a tiny nod. I absolutely did not trust myself to open my mouth and speak. As the long evening progressed, the expensive alcohol flowed freely and the large dance floor completely filled with sweaty guests. The cutting of the massive cake, the romantic first dance, the tearful father-daughter dance, all unfolded perfectly according to their grand plan. I remained standing on the dark periphery of the room near the exit doors. I observed it all with detached, cold interest, feeling exactly like a scientist studying the bizarre rituals of an unfamiliar culture. Around midnight, as the loud party was still in full swing, my parents cornered me near the empty dessert table. My mother grabbed my arm. Her words were slightly slurred from drinking too much wine. She smiled and said, "Valerie, you have been so quiet all day long. Are you not having a wonderfully good time?" I looked at her flushed face. I replied in a completely neutral tone, "It is a very beautiful wedding, Mother." My father laughed loudly and winked at me. He said, "It is the absolute best wedding that money could buy." I looked him dead in the eyes. I did not blink. I said softly, "Or the best wedding a stolen lake house could buy, I should say." My father paused, completely missing my dark tone. He just laughed loudly at his own terrible joke. He patted my shoulder. My mother squeezed my arm again. She leaned in close and whispered, "We really never properly thanked you, Valerie. Thank you for being so understanding about the house sale. It really was the only possible way we could afford to give Priscilla the wedding she truly deserved." I stood there and looked at both of them. These were the exact two people who had raised me from birth. They had just casually admitted to stealing my entire future from me, speaking as casually as if they were commenting on the rainy weather. A very strange, icy calm completely settled over my entire body. My hands stopped shaking. I smiled a very slight, terrifying smile. I looked at my father and said, "You should really make sure you check your front porch mail tomorrow morning." My father stopped laughing. He frowned in deep confusion. He asked, "What? Why? What is arriving?" I stepped backward toward the exit doors. I kept my voice perfectly level. I said, "Just some heavy information that I think you both will find extremely interesting. Please, enjoy the rest of the evening." I turned around and walked out of the ballroom, leaving them standing by the cake table looking deeply confused and slightly worried. Walking out of those heavy doors was the absolute only moment of genuine satisfaction I had felt all day long. The extravagant wedding finally concluded with a grand, sparkling send-off. Priscilla and Desmond departed for their 3-week luxury honeymoon in a vintage, silver Bentley. The cheering guests tossed hundreds of expensive rose petals into the air as the heavy car slowly pulled away from the estate. My parents stood together on the front steps, arm in arm, looking physically exhausted but entirely triumphant. I returned to my quiet, dark apartment in the city. I kicked off my painful heels. I sat down on my couch and pulled out my cell phone. I typed a quick text message to Gwendolyn. It read, "The wedding is complete. Please proceed exactly as planned tomorrow morning." The next morning, the sun rose brightly over the city. I sat at my kitchen table, drinking a hot cup of black coffee. I watched the clock on my microwave. At precisely 9 o'clock in the morning, a uniformed legal courier walked up the driveway of my parents' house. He legally delivered the massive, heavy package of legal documents directly into the hands of my father. The thick envelope contained absolute, undeniable documentation of the massive forgery. It contained the sworn, written statements from Marjorie and the furious notary public. It contained the printed bank records clearly showing the illegal transfer of funds. And it contained the formal, terrifying legal notices from the law firm stating the immediate actions being taken to completely reverse the sale and legally investigate the severe fraud. Simultaneously, I clicked a button on my laptop and sent my personal, devastating confrontation letter via email to both of my parents. I sat at my table and waited. I watched the screen of my cell phone. At exactly 9:01, the screen lit up. My phone began ringing loudly. First, the caller ID showed my father. I let it ring until it stopped. Then, the screen showed my mother. I let it ring. Then back to my father again. I let every single call go straight to my automated voicemail. At 9:30, the frantic text messages started pouring in. My phone vibrated endlessly against the wooden table. My father texted, "Valerie, what the hell is this thick package? You need to call us immediately. There has been a terrible, massive misunderstanding." My mother texted, "Please answer your phone right now, Valerie. You cannot do this to us. You cannot do this to your sister. We desperately need to talk to you." My father texted again, "Valerie, pick up the phone. We can fix this." I did not type a single letter in response to any of them. I simply sat there and watched the desperate messages pile up on the screen. By 12 noon, several other extended family members began calling my phone. Apparently, my panicking parents had started aggressively reaching out to aunts and uncles, either begging for emotional support or trying desperately to manage the collapsing narrative. My phone buzzed constantly with long messages expressing deep confusion, profound shock, and in some cases, massive outrage on my behalf once they learned the actual truth. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, my phone rang again. This time, the screen displayed an unknown, long international phone number. I knew exactly who it was. I swiped the screen and answered the call. It was Priscilla. She was calling me all the way from her luxury overwater bungalow in the Maldives. The connection was slightly crackly. She was screaming into the phone. She yelled, "What the hell is wrong with you, Valerie? Mom and Dad are entirely freaking out. They called me crying. They said you are actually suing them with a lawyer on the very day after my beautiful wedding. How could you possibly be so incredibly selfish?" I held the phone away from my ear for a moment. I took a deep breath. I spoke very calmly and clearly. I asked her, "Priscilla, did they actually tell you exactly why I am suing them?" She scoffed loudly into the receiver. She said, "Something stupid about the lake house. They said you suddenly changed your mind about helping them with the wedding bills and now you are just being incredibly vindictive and cruel." I closed my eyes. I gripped the phone tightly. I said, "Priscilla, listen to me very carefully. They illegally forged my legal signature. They sold my entire house behind my back without my permission. They aggressively stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from my inheritance just to pay for your massive wedding. I never, ever agreed to sell that property. Tell me the truth right now. Did you know about the theft?" There was a very long, heavy pause on the international line. The only sound I heard was the static of the connection and the faint sound of ocean waves in the background. Finally, Priscilla spoke. Her voice was suddenly much smaller and completely devoid of her usual arrogance. She stammered, I knew they were using the massive money from the lake house sale to pay the vendors. But I swear, Valerie, they told me that you had happily agreed to it. They swore that you were doing it as a massive wedding gift." I felt a sharp spike of anger. I asked her, "And you actually believed that ridiculous lie? You honestly believed that I would happily give up my entire inheritance from Grandpa Arthur, my most prized possession in the world, just to fund your one single day of celebration?" She started crying through the phone. She protested weakly, "It is not just one day, Valerie. It is my beautiful marriage. It is my entire future with Desmond." I cut her off sharply. I said, "Your marriage and your future with Desmond have absolutely nothing to do with stealing my private property. If you truly knew nothing about the illegal forgery, then my legal issue is not with you. But if I find out that you were complicit in this massive fraud in any way, there will be extremely severe legal consequences for you, too." Priscilla sobbed loudly into the receiver. She wailed, "You are completely ruining everything, Valerie. We are going to have to pack our bags and fly home early now. Desmond is absolutely furious about this mess." I stared out my kitchen window. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I said coldly, "I am sorry your expensive honeymoon is being interrupted. But this is a massive criminal situation of Mom and Dad's making, not mine. Have a safe flight home." I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button to hang up. I immediately powered off my cell phone entirely. I desperately needed some quiet space away from the endless barrage of toxic family drama. Instead, I picked up my old landline phone and called Gwendolyn at her law office to get a status update. Gwendolyn answered immediately. She sounded highly professional and sharply focused. She reported, "Your parents frantically contacted my law office an hour ago. They are desperately asking for an immediate, in-person meeting. They are crying and saying they want to resolve this quietly as a family without any further legal or police involvement." I scoffed loudly. I said, "It is way too late for that. What about the buyers? What about Clifford and Estelle?" Gwendolyn replied, "I have personally spoken to their attorney and explained the entire fraudulent situation. They are understandably extremely upset, but they are fully cooperating with the legal process to unwind the false sale. They will be seeking massive financial damages directly from your parents for the horrible fraud, but they are absolutely not blaming you for this mess." By the time evening arrived, I finally turned my cell phone back on. The screen instantly lit up with dozens of missed calls and unread messages. The most notable one was a new text from my father. It read, "Valerie. We are holding a mandatory family emergency meeting tomorrow afternoon at our house. 2 o'clock sharp. Please come. We need to fix this terrible mistake." I called Gwendolyn again. I also consulted with Martin, the fierce criminal attorney she had brought onto my case. Both of them strongly advised me not to step foot into that house to meet with my parents alone. We quickly agreed that Gwendolyn would physically accompany me to the house to act as my aggressive legal representation and to ensure they did not try to manipulate me. When we finally pulled into the driveway of my parents' house the next afternoon, I noticed several extra cars parked on the street. I walked up to the front door with Gwendolyn by my side. I opened the door and walked into the living room. I was completely surprised to find not just my nervous parents waiting on the couches, but an entire crowd. Priscilla and Desmond were sitting there, looking exhausted and jet-lagged, apparently having flown back early from their ruined honeymoon. My father's loud brother, Uncle Steve, and my mother's nosy sister, Aunt Patricia, were also sitting in the armchairs. Clearly, my desperate parents had called in massive reinforcements to try and bully me into dropping the lawsuit. My father stood up quickly when I walked into the room. He looked absolutely shocked when he saw Gwendolyn standing tall right next to me holding a heavy briefcase. He pointed at her and demanded, "Who is this woman?" I clearly said this was for family only. I stood tall. I looked him in the eye and said clearly, "This is Gwendolyn. She is my attorney. She goes absolutely wherever I go for any discussions regarding this criminal matter." My mother wrung her hands nervously. She protested weakly from the couch, "Valerie, please. We really do not need lawyers involved for a simple family discussion." I glared at her. I replied sharply, "This completely stopped being just a simple family discussion the very second you forged my name and committed massive fraud." The entire living room fell uncomfortably, deathly silent. Priscilla sat slumped on the expensive leather couch. She looked pale and terrible, still wearing her wrinkled traveling clothes. Desmond stood stiffly behind her, his face tight with extreme, visible anger. Uncle Steve and Aunt Patricia exchanged very uneasy, wide-eyed glances. My father sighed heavily. He tried to use a soft, placating tone. He stepped forward and held his hands up. He said, "Valerie, honey. We know you are extremely upset right now. There was a terrible, terrible misunderstanding about the lake house. We honestly thought we had your implicit consent to sell it." I felt a hot flash of pure rage crawl up my neck. I repeated the words loudly. "Implicit consent? You illegally forged my physical signature on state legal documents. You sold a massive piece of property that did not belong to you. You aggressively took hundreds of thousands of dollars that were not yours to take. Which exact part of that was a misunderstanding, Dad?" My mother started crying. She wiped her eyes and said weakly, "We were going to slowly pay you back, Valerie. We swear we were." I snapped back at her. "With what money? When was there ever a solid financial plan? Or were you just desperately hoping I would never drive up there and find out until it was way too late? No one in the room answered me. The silence was heavy and suffocating. I opened my briefcase. I pulled out my laptop and grabbed an HDMI cable. I completely ignored their protests and plugged my computer directly into their large flat-screen television. I stood in front of the screen. I said coldly, "Let me show all of you exactly what happened so there is absolutely no more room for any pathetic misunderstandings." Over the next painful 30 minutes, I stood in that living room and presented the massive mountain of evidence Gwendolyn and I had compiled. I displayed the forged county documents on the big screen, zooming in closely on my fake signature. I displayed the printed bank records clearly showing the massive transfer of funds directly correlating with the exact dates of the expensive wedding vendor payments. I presented a detailed, color-coded timeline of events clearly showing their deliberate, months-long deception. I read aloud the sworn, written statement from Marjorie about the damning conversation she had accidentally overheard in the store. Finally, I displayed the legal proof that the official stamp and signature of the notary public had also been completely forged. When I finally finished clicking through the slides and closed my laptop, the living room was as quiet as a graveyard. Priscilla was openly, loudly sobbing into her hands. Desmond looked furious and completely humiliated, looking like he wanted to be absolutely anywhere else on earth. My aunt and uncle sat frozen in their chairs, appearing completely horrified and disgusted by the actions of their own siblings. I turned around to face my parents. I asked them, "Do you have any actual idea what you have done? Not just legally, but to our family? To our relationship? You aggressively stole from me. You violently violated my deep trust in the most fundamental way physically possible. And for what? So Priscilla could have shiny gold flakes on her towering wedding cake?" My father finally spoke. His voice was subdued, broken, and completely defeated. He looked at the floor and said, "We made a terrible, terrible mistake, Valerie. We got so caught up in giving Priscilla the perfect wedding she demanded. We panicked. We told ourselves we would somehow figure out how to make it right with you later." I shook my head in disgust. By creating a false, twisted narrative where I had happily agreed to sell it? By maliciously gaslighting me and aggressively lying to our entire extended family to make yourselves look like heroes? My mother cried harder. She admitted between loud sobs, "We just panicked, Valerie. Once we started down this horrible path, we did not know how to stop the lies." Priscilla looked up from her hands. Her expensive makeup was completely streaked with dark tears. She looked at me and cried, "I really did not know they forged your signature, Valerie. I swear to God. They told me you had happily agreed to help with the wedding by selling the old lake house. I thought it was incredibly generous of you, but not impossible to believe. You have always been the incredibly responsible one. You are the one who always makes the big sacrifices for me." That last sentence hung heavily in the stale air of the room. It unintentionally revealed the absolute, toxic core of the family dynamic that had made this entire horrific situation possible in the first place. I had always been expected to sacrifice my own happiness for Priscilla. This theft was simply the most extreme, criminal version of a toxic pattern that had been firmly established decades ago. Uncle Steve loudly cleared his throat. He stood up from his chair. He pointed an angry finger at my father. He shouted, "I had absolutely no idea any of this illegal garbage was happening. Thomas, Elizabeth, what the hell were you two thinking? This is your own daughter. You stole from your own child." My mother shrank back into the cushions. She said quietly, "We always wildly favored Priscilla. We never meant to do it, but we did. She always needed more help, she demanded more attention, and we simply responded to her constant demands. Valerie was always so incredibly capable. She was so totally self-sufficient. We just completely took her strength for granted." I crossed my arms tightly across my chest. I said firmly, taking me for granted is absolutely not a legal excuse for committing grand theft. My father nodded slowly. The fight had completely left his body. He said, "No, it is not an excuse. Nothing completely excuses what we did to you. We violently betrayed you, Valerie. We broke the law, and we violated your trust, and we are so deeply sorry." Their tearful apologies felt both entirely genuine and completely, wholly inadequate. The massive damage was already done. The trust, once broken at such a deep, fundamental level, could absolutely not be easily repaired with a few tears. My mother wiped her nose with a tissue. She pleaded, "We will do absolutely whatever it takes to make this right with you, Valerie. Please tell us what to do." My father looked nervously at Gwendolyn. He asked, "What exactly happens now?" Gwendolyn stepped forward. Her voice was sharp and professional. She replied, "The legal process to completely unwind the fraudulent house sale is already currently underway in the courts. The Petersons will need to be heavily financially compensated for their extreme troubles and relocation. There will be massive financial penalties, court costs, and incredibly high legal fees. As for the serious criminal charges, that will ultimately be up to the district attorney to decide, although the personal wishes of Valerie will carry significant weight in their final decision." Every single eye in the room nervously turned to look at me. I took a deep breath. I stated my demands clearly and firmly. I said, "I want my lake house back in my name immediately. I want every single penny that was stolen from me returned to my account, plus high interest and massive emotional damages. I want a formal, public written acknowledgement of what you did sent to the entire family, and a sincere apology to every single person you aggressively lied to about me. And I want you both to attend intensive, mandatory psychological counseling to understand exactly why you thought committing a felony against your own child was acceptable behavior." My parents nodded their heads mutely. They looked completely broken. I continued, my voice hard as steel. "As for the criminal charges, I do not want to see my own parents rotting in a jail cell. But, as Gwendolyn said, that may not be entirely up to me. What you did was a massive felony crime, and there will absolutely be severe consequences beyond what I can control. Making this right will take years of time. And things will never, ever be the same between us again. That is the real, permanent cost of what you stole from me." As Gwendolyn and I finally walked out of the front door and left the quiet house, I felt a very strange, complicated mix of deep vindication and profound sadness. I had finally, aggressively stood up for myself. But at what terrible cost? The family unit I had known my entire life was completely, irreparably destroyed. Yet, as I breathed in the fresh outside air, somehow I also felt incredibly lighter, as if a massive, suffocating burden I had carried on my shoulders for decades had finally been completely set down. The grueling, expensive legal aftermath slowly unfolded over the next 6 long months. The fraudulent sale of the lake house was officially invalidated by a judge, with the court ruling clearly that the forged documents could not transfer legal property ownership. The Petersons were understandably extremely upset, but they ultimately settled out of court for a massive financial compensation package from my parents. This package included all of their extensive moving expenses, their high legal fees, and additional heavy damages for the massive inconvenience. To afford this, my parents were forced to completely liquidate their retirement investments. They had to take out a massive, high-interest home equity loan against their primary residence just to repay me the full market value of the lake property, plus all the mandated interest and damages. They very narrowly avoided serving actual prison time after the district attorney finally agreed to a strict plea deal. The deal included hundreds of hours of grueling community service, total financial restitution, and years of mandatory psychological counseling. The beautiful lake house finally, legally returned to my possession, though not without severe emotional complications. The very first time I drove up to visit after officially regaining the property deed, I walked out onto the wooden dock. I sat there for hours, watching the water ripple. I tried to reconnect with the property and process the massive trauma that had happened. The quiet space felt deeply different to me now. It felt somehow darkly tainted by the violent betrayal of my parents. Yet, it was still fundamentally, legally mine. I spent that entire summer aggressively restoring the lake house, healing both the physical structure and my own broken spirit. I immediately hired a contractor to replace all the exterior locks and install a state-of-the-art security system with cameras. I spent my weekends repainting the interior walls with fresh, bright colors. I sanded and refinished the scuffed wooden floors on my hands and knees. I completely updated the old kitchen that had remained largely unchanged since the time of Grandpa Arthur. Every single physical improvement I made felt like I was aggressively reclaiming the space, aggressively making it completely mine again. My relationship with my fractured family slowly entered a very new, distant phase. Priscilla and I spoke very infrequently. At first, our brief phone conversations were incredibly awkward, tense, and strained. She had been forced to shamefully return most of her expensive wedding gifts to guests after the entire family learned the dark truth about how the wedding was funded. Though she and Desmond somehow remained legally married, their luxury honeymoon had been abruptly cut short, and the fairy tale beginning to their new marriage had been completely, irreparably tarnished by the massive scandal. During one of our rare, quiet phone calls, Priscilla finally gathered the courage to ask the burning question that had clearly been bothering her for months. She asked quietly, "Valerie, would you have actually helped Mom and Dad with the wedding bills if they had just asked you directly? Would you have ever sold the lake house voluntarily to help me?" I sat on my couch and considered the heavy question very carefully. I answered honestly. I said firmly, "No. I would not have. The lake house was never mine to just give away for a flashy party. It was the lifelong legacy of Grandpa Arthur. It was his entire life's work. He deliberately entrusted it to me specifically because he knew I deeply valued it for what it actually was, not for what cash it could be quickly converted into. I might have happily contributed a few $1,000s from my savings account to help with your dress, but selling the house was never, ever an option." Priscilla was completely quiet for a long moment. She finally sighed and admitted, "I think I always secretly knew that deep down. Maybe that is exactly why I never questioned the bizarre story of Mom and Dad too deeply. It was just so much easier to selfishly believe that you had magically agreed to sell it than to actually face the hard truth." My parents and I established a very careful, incredibly distant boundary. We spoke briefly on the phone maybe once a month. We met occasionally at neutral restaurants for very brief, quiet meals. But the easy, naive familiarity of our past was completely dead and gone. They diligently continued with their mandatory court-ordered counseling. They were gradually, painfully coming to terms with the massive psychological damage they had caused, and the toxic parenting patterns that had inevitably led to their criminal actions. During one particularly difficult lunch conversation, my mother stirred her coffee nervously. She looked at me and said, "We always honestly thought we were doing what was best for both of you girls. Priscilla just always seemed to need so much more support, so much more attention, so many more resources to survive. You were always so incredibly capable, Valerie. You were so independent." We foolishly told ourselves that it all balanced out somehow in the end. I put my fork down on my plate. I looked at her completely straight in the eyes. I replied coldly, "It never balanced out, Mom. You took my fierce independence as absolute permission to simply give everything you had to Priscilla. Being a self-sufficient, hard-working woman became a direct punishment in this family." My father nodded slowly, staring at his hands. He said, "We clearly see that terrible truth now. We completely failed you, Valerie. Not just with the theft of the lake house, but throughout your entire life. We took your incredible strength completely for granted instead of nurturing it." These quiet conversations were incredibly painful, but they were absolutely necessary for me to hear. They represented the very first honest, truthful exchanges we had ever had about the toxic family dynamic that had aggressively shaped all of our lives. 6 full months after the disastrous wedding, I held a small, private gathering at the beautifully restored lake house. I only invited my very close friends who had fiercely supported me through the entire legal ordeal, as well as a few extended family members, like Aunt Patricia and Uncle Steve, who had reached out with genuine, loving concern. My parents and Priscilla were absolutely not invited to attend. It was a strict, hard boundary that felt entirely necessary for my continued psychological healing. As we all sat happily around the stone fire pit that Grandpa Arthur had built with his own 2 hands, watching the beautiful orange sunset reflect over the rippling water of the lake, my good friend Nadine stood up. She raised her glass of wine high in the air. She smiled broadly and yelled over the crackling fire, "To Valerie, the woman who fiercely taught all of us that standing up for yourself and protecting your boundaries is absolutely not selfish. It is entirely necessary." The simple, beautiful toast brought hot tears to my eyes. For so many long years, I had quietly accepted the toxic narrative that putting my own needs first was somehow inherently wrong or greedy. I had believed that quiet sacrifice was my permanently designated role in this family. Breaking that generational pattern had been incredibly painful, messy, and exhausting. But it had been absolutely essential for my survival. The quiet lake house completely became my safe sanctuary in a brand new, profound way. I began actively spending at least one full weekend a month up there, sometimes enjoying the quiet alone, sometimes hosting loud dinners with my friends. I firmly established brand new traditions and built completely new, happy memories to replace the dark ones. I planted a massive vegetable garden in the backyard that bloomed beautifully in the spring. I built a cozy reading nook in the sunroom overlooking the water. I finally learned how to properly sail on the old wooden boat of Grandpa Arthur that I had carefully, lovingly restored by hand. A full year after the disastrous wedding, Priscilla and Desmond somehow managed to welcome their first child into the world, a tiny daughter. The birth of the baby created a small, fragile opportunity for cautious family reconciliation. I drove to the hospital to visit them in the maternity ward. I sat in the plastic chair, holding my tiny new niece in my arms, feeling the incredibly complicated, heavy emotions of deep family bonds that stubbornly persist despite massive, bleeding wounds. Priscilla sat up in her hospital bed. She watched me slowly rock the sleeping baby. She looked at me with tired, sincere eyes and said quietly, "I really want her to know her strong Aunt Valerie. I want her to grow up and know the beautiful lake house. I want her to understand the legacy of Grandpa Arthur. I want things to be completely different for her than they were for us." I looked down at the baby. It was the absolute closest thing to a genuine, heartfelt apology I had ever received from my sister. It was a clear acknowledgement that the toxic generational patterns absolutely needed to change for the sake of the next generation. 2 full years after the scandalous wedding, I finally invited my parents to drive up to the lake house for the very first time since the horrible incident. It was a very brief visit, just a quiet afternoon lunch, but it was an incredibly important step forward for my own peace of mind. They walked slowly through the newly renovated space with visible, heavy emotion on their faces. They carefully noted all the beautiful changes I had made, while seeing how I completely respected the original, rustic character of the home. My father stood in the hallway. He ran his hand gently along the original, hand-carved woodwork. He said quietly, "Arthur would be incredibly proud of what you have done here, Valerie. He always said that you truly understood the deep value of this place in a way the rest of us simply never did." My mother paused in the living room. She stood silently by the large, framed photograph of Grandpa Arthur that I had placed prominently on the stone mantel above the fireplace. She wiped a tear from her cheek. She said softly, "We completely lost sight of what actually matters in this life. We got entirely caught up in maintaining fake appearances, in catering to the loud demands of Priscilla, in our own deep insecurities as aging parents. We completely forgot that some things, like the deep trust of your own child, are worth far more than money can ever measure." Their quiet afternoon visit was absolutely neither a full, magical reconciliation nor a complete, sweeping forgiveness. It was simply an honest acknowledgement that deep emotional healing is a very slow process, not a sudden event. Some small fragments of trust might eventually be slowly rebuilt over the coming years, but our relationship would absolutely never, ever return to what it was before they forged my name. And as I watched their car slowly back out of the gravel driveway and drive away, I realized that perhaps that distance was entirely for the best. The most profoundly important lesson I learned through this entire, exhausting nightmare ordeal was about the absolute, critical nature of setting firm boundaries. For years and years, I had quietly allowed my toxic family to deeply take advantage of my quiet independence and my strong resilience. I had silently accepted far less love, while Priscilla aggressively demanded and received far more. I kept telling myself that it simply did not matter, that I did not need their financial support or their vocal approval to be successful in life. But I realized that in doing so, by staying silent, I had actually enabled the very toxic dynamic that ultimately led to the horrific theft of my inheritance. Aggressively standing up for myself with a lawyer was not just about reclaiming the physical property of the lake house. It was about aggressively reclaiming my rightful place in the narrative of my own family. It was about looking them in the eye and saying clearly, I matter. My personal needs matter. My legal inheritance matters. My boundaries matter. And I will fiercely protect them against anyone, even my own blood. 3 years after the disastrous wedding, I stood alone on the edge of the wooden dock at sunset. The cool breeze blew through my hair. I watched the golden light play across the rippling water. The beautiful lake house was fully, legally mine again in every single sense of the word. I had fiercely defended it, I had successfully reclaimed it, I had lovingly restored it, and I had intentionally made beautiful new memories within its strong wooden walls. The legacy of Grandpa Arthur continued, not just in the physical structure of the cabin, but in the fierce, unyielding strength he had seen in me long before I ever recognized it in myself. As I prepare to finally end my story today, I want to turn to you and ask you a very important question. Have you ever had to fiercely stand up to toxic family members who aggressively crossed your important personal boundaries? How exactly did you handle the messy fallout? And what crucial lessons did you learn from the painful experience? I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts and read your personal stories in the comments below. And if my journey resonated with you today, please do me a favor and hit that like button. Subscribe to my channel for more stories about navigating toxic family dynamics and finding personal growth. And please share this video with someone who might desperately need to hear that it is absolutely okay to fiercely protect what is rightfully theirs. Thank you so much for listening to my journey today. And always remember that sometimes the most important, critical relationships we need to aggressively protect and nurture in this life are the ones we have with ourselves. Stay strong, everyone. See you in the next video.